I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's.
Did the CIA write Wind of Change by the Scorpions?
As humans busied themselves about the various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied.
Dr. Loeb, what percentage chance do you give it that you have indeed uncovered extraterrestrial or non-human technology?
With infinite complacence, people went about their affairs, yet across an immense ethereal gulf, intellects vast and unsympathetic drew their plans against us.
All of a sudden, a stick out of nowhere landed right in front of us, and there was no tree, nothing overhead. Something threw it at us.
Yeah.
All Things Unexplained.
So some of that, I think, sir, we'll save for closed session.
Hello, all you unexplained ones. Thank you for joining us. I am CJ Derringer, your co-host. I'm here with my friend and co-host, Dr. Tim Mounts. Hey, Tim.
Hey, CJ, how's it going tonight?
Good. How are you?
Great. It's pretty exciting to be back, and it's been a busy day. You know, we had a Department of Defense briefing this afternoon. We made a little post about it, so I encourage everybody to head over to our Twitter and check that out. We're kind of blowing up over there right now on a little post we made that's at AT Unexplained. Ross Coulthart, you know, he retweeted our post
that's
about this whole drone thing.
I also retweeted it.
Yes.
Just saying.
That's why it's viral now.
Ross Coulthart. Same. Yeah.
And now's the time, of course, to find out more about this giant UFO that we've been wondering about it.
You're right. Did you ask him?
Not yet. I'm gonna let it play out a little bit before I do that.
Let's just get him on the show. That's what we need.
Yeah, he's turned us down every time so far, but you know, I mean, he's a busy man. What can you do?
There's always the next time you ask.
Yeah, what can you do? And of course, we have some shows coming out. Next week, it'll be, I don't know how we're going to handle this, but next Friday night, it'll be just Smeety and me.
You'll be just fine.
The guys in North Carolina who filmed some unexplained drones, speaking of the drones, or something, over the Duke nuclear plant in Southport, North Carolina.
Yeah, that's scary. I wish I was going to be there for that one. I'm sad to miss. That sounds like a great episode. But speaking of great episodes, we have a wonderful episode for you tonight. We thank you all for joining us. If you haven't yet, please do subscribe to our channel, like, share, and as Tim said, go find us on social media and engage. Also, we will take any of your comments or questions that you have here. We'll try to bring them into the show if we can. And we have a returning guest tonight. We are so grateful to have her back and to get her insight into the world of academics and things that are going on there that are changing rapidly and drastically. We have Dr. Elizabeth Weiss, who is joining us. She is a professor over at San José State. You can find her most recent article in the Journal of Controversial Ideas. If that didn't pique your interest, that's the Journal of Controversial Ideas. And her article is titled, "The Study of California's Past is Dead and Reburied." We are very excited to talk to her about that, and she will be joining us in just one moment right after this break. All Things Unexplained is free to watch on YouTube and listen to wherever you get your podcasts. If you would like to support our show, you can visit our YouTube store. Additionally, you can find us on Venmo under All Things Unexplained. Be sure to check out our website, allthingsunexplained.com. All proceeds from the sales of Dr. Mounts' books on Amazon and Audible also go straight to our show. Hello, Elizabeth. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on tonight.
Absolutely. We're so glad to have you back. We had such an engaging discussion the last time we had you. And Tim, maybe you can put in the notes for this show what episode that was last time we had her, for anybody that wants to dive into a little bit more of your background and how you got to where you are today. But for those that are new to you, why don't you give us just a quick little synopsis of your background and this article that you recently wrote?
So I'm a professor of anthropology. My area of expertise is studying the skeletal remains of past peoples. And mostly those are past peoples from the Americas, right? So Native American, the first Americans. And I use skeletal remains to try to reconstruct what their lives were like, but also to see what similarities there are between them and other populations around the world, to see what is there in the bones and in the teeth, the bones, that is indicative of culture, and what is indicative of biology. And so even though I study the past, I oftentimes make links to the present, and sometimes even try to predict what will happen in the future using these skeletal remains. I wrote a book a few years back called Paleopathology in Perspective, and it's on looking at disease in the past, present, and seeing patterns that might help us in the future. So that's where I'm coming from. And a few years ago, in 2020, I published a book on the issue about reburial of skeletal remains and the laws behind that, specifically the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is a federal or nationwide law. And then also now I've been writing about CalNAGPRA, which is a California version of that. And that is the topic that I cover in that journal article, Journal Controversial Ideas. So that's pretty much my background. Some people may be like, how did she get on this show? And I must confess that my husband is Nick Pope. He's been on the show too. And so that's where the alien or UFO link comes in.
Well, we do cover lots of topics, so they're not all aliens and UFOs. We have plenty of academics on here. So you are in the right place, and we are happy to have you. Real quick before we go on, I am getting a little bit of feedback from you. Are you getting that too, Tim, when she's talking? It's almost as if your voice is coming out of your own speakers and then back into
Yes, I'm getting it.
your microphone. I don't know if you have any headphones nearby.
I don't. Does that work better? Is it better when I'm a little farther away?
It's just a little echo. The best thing you could probably do is turn your speakers down a little bit when you're talking.
Okay.
I think that's what's happening, is your voice is going in and then back out. And I just want to make sure that everybody can hear you clearly.
How is that?
Oh, that's better.
Am I still echoing?
It's not as much. It's a little bit, but yeah, I think that will do. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so here you are. You're joining us, and you've been met with some obstacles in your professional career in the recent past, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
So basically, in 2020, I published a book, right, with an attorney by the name of James W. Springer, expressing concern that the skeletal collections from past peoples, the collections that I studied and others studied to understand the past, are being reburied at a phenomenal rate. And they're being reburied without any true link to modern populations. So one of the things is that we often hear that there's all these collections that should have been reburied years ago because the law, NAGPRA, was passed 34 years ago. But what is often ignored is that the collections that had links to modern tribes actually have already been reburied, have already been given back to tribes. What was left over was not clearly linked to any modern tribe, and therefore should have been left alone from repatriation or reburial and available to study, because that's how the law was written initially, to enable both science and the religious beliefs and the sentiments of Native American tribes and their connections to their ancestors to move forward. However, what's happened instead is that we get a broadening of what is to be reburied. And so now what is being attacked is not just the collections that have links to modern tribes, but all prehistoric collections. And CalNAGPRA, the California version of that, epitomizes this, because basically it says if there is a disagreement between Native American tribes and the science, that we must take the Native American story seriously and give deference to it as opposed to the science. So you can just imagine that you have a Native American bone that's 10,000 years old, has no link to any modern living tribe, and yet a tribe comes along and says, no, wait, this is our ancient one. This is the one we've heard about in our oral myths, and therefore it should be reburied. And in California now, that's all it takes for the reburial to occur.
So it seems like it has gone from this law that was there to protect, right, various different tribes, to now this overarching rule that's applied to everyone. But it even feels like in the past year or two, based on your article, like things have really changed. So tell us a little bit about the research that you did and what you found.
Yeah, so I got a grant from Heterodox Academy and the Schmidt Foundation that basically gave me time and a little bit of money to look into what the state of archaeology and anthropology is for California public universities. So what's recently happened is that the CalNAGPRA laws have added 2 caveats. One of those caveats, or one of those additions, is that collections that are teaching collections are not now targeted. Now, teaching collections are interesting because they are not collections like a research collection where it's just like of one site and we have very good records of it. Teaching collections is what's used to train forensic anthropologists, for example, on how to identify human remains. And so there are a hodgepodge of remains from medical samples that have been donated to, in my own experience, like teeth that have been given from dentists, that they pull, that they give as a donation from their patients, to things from historic sites to Native American sites. And most of these remains are broken, fragmented, so forth, because that's how you really learn about the skeleton, is to try to be able to identify not a whole bone. I could teach everyone in the audience how to identify 206 bones in a matter of probably a day. But can somebody identify a fragment of a bone and then tell us whether it's human or non-human, modern or not, and male or female, or child or adult? And that's what we teach using our teaching collections. And these collections now are at risk because the new law, which was passed just this beginning of this year, basically says that if there's any chance that any of these remains are Native American, then the whole collection must be off limits. And so what they've done is they've basically shut down teaching collections. But they've gone further, and they've said that it's not just about teaching collections, it's not just about research collections, it's also about data, images, photography, slides. And certain universities like Cal State University, Bakersfield, has a moratorium on distribution, display, dissemination, and use of anything that is human remains or artifacts that may be Native American, including archival data, photographs, slides, x-rays. And so what we're basically seeing is that professors are getting their hands tied, not only with not being able to conduct research, but not being able to teach their classes. And this is what I discovered when I was looking at the availability of collections in both the the California State University, which has 23 campuses, and the University of California, which I believe has 11 campuses. Currently, there is not a single collection that's available for research or teaching in these universities, all of basically public California universities.
So are there any remains available for people to study? It seems like we need them to learn, right? We need human remains to learn about the human body. Is there anything?
So it's kind of interesting. When I reached out to the universities, and I reached out to each one of them individually and tried to make sure that I hit somebody in the email list that would have this information. So I contacted physical anthropologists, archaeologists, NAGPRA coordinators, tribal liaisons, so anybody who would have knowledge of these things. And one of the things I found out, so in my questions, I asked, are there any collections available to study? And I specifically said Native American or not Native American. And I got no positive responses, which literally means that currently, if you want to do research on skeletal remains in California at one of the public universities, one of the 34 public universities, there is no collection to be had. And the only exception was Cal State University Fresno has a forensic collection. So what a forensic collection is a collection where people have donated their bodies. We call these forensic collections because we know the person's exact age, sex, sometimes ethnicity, and so forth. So we know certain things that we wouldn't have known otherwise. And so the Fresno collection, that's a forensic collection, is still currently not available to study, but I was told that they're doing the inventory and trying to figure out what requirements they will have, and then once they do that the collection may be available to study in the future. We will see in maybe like a year or so whether that becomes true. I'm disconcerted about this because I think that there's a very high possibility at the rate of how things are going, where skeletal collections, regardless of whether they are Native American or non-Native American, are being targeted for sensitivity issues, and therefore even that collection may either eventually not be available or may never become available again. And we see this in the Smithsonian. One of the interesting things about the Smithsonian was they had a exhibit on non-Native Americans, on Jamestown colonialists who had historic evidence of perhaps, of definitely starvation and perhaps cannibalism. And they had an exhibit called Written in Bone. And it was a temporary exhibit that highlighted the connections between historic archaeology and forensics. And they had an online exhibit that was like a companion exhibit for those who could not go to the museum, or for teachers who would then use it in their classroom either before or after they made the visit, or stand alone. And now if you go to that same website, the Written in Stone Smithsonian website, what you find is a 4-page apology of how they've decided that they are not going to show the skeletal remains after all, even though the ancestors of these Jamestown colonialists were in favor of it and had expressed that before, that they were in favor of the remains being shown, studied, and on display on the internet. But the Smithsonian's sensitivity censors have decided otherwise and basically have taken it off of the web. And I worry that this is where we're going to go, where not only Native American collections will be off limits, but all collections will be off limits. And we will be the poorer for it because our forensic anthropologists will be poorly trained. Medical doctors will not get as good education in anatomy. One of the things that people don't realize often is that anatomy instructors often are anthropologists. So the next generation of anthropologists who teach your medical doctor anatomy may not be as good in anatomy as he should be.
Yeah, it seems like there is a gentle balance of needing some of these remains in order to further our education about our past, about our present, about our future, and for medical purposes, what have you, and also respecting tribal wishes. And that's a delicate balance, of course. It's like, who decides who's right? I don't know. But that brings us to some more of the controversies that you faced. I know Tim had some questions about that.
And we're so pleased to be joined by Dr. Elizabeth Weiss. The link to her article is in the show notes and description, so you can check out her article there, her latest article that we're talking about. Also, check out her book on Amazon, On the Warpath. She discussed this book with her in our first episode with Elizabeth, and we'll also link that up. On the Warpath, My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors. A really, truly classic title for sure, right there, of a book. And that's available on Amazon. And Elizabeth, one thing I wanted to bring up real quick is I noticed on your Twitter that recently a pioneer in archaeology, Marshall Joseph Becker, passed away. And I wanted to know if you wanted to say anything about Marshall Becker.
Yeah, Marshall was, he was someone who I had never met actually in person, but I had been in correspondence with for years. And one of the interesting things is that he passed away about, I think on the 26th of November, if I'm not mistaken, either 26th or 27th. And he was one of the first people when issues about repatriation arose and the cancel culture campaign against me and against the book, Repatriation and Erasing the Past, came up. He was one of the first people to contact me because he himself did research, and he's was Pennsylvania, so he did a lot of Native American research on the wampum belts that are those bead belts that were used for trading. But as a traditional physical anthropologist, he also did skeletal research on Romans and from around the world. And so when he first contacted me and we were corresponding about the problems of reburial, he also said, if you need anything, please let me know. And so when I was locked out of the curation facility that held the skeletal remains that I was studying by my university, and I was in fear of losing my job for speaking out about the importance of preserving skeletal remains, I was suing. I decided to take action and sue my university instead of wait and see what they did, right? He stepped right up and he wrote an affidavit about the importance of studying skeletal remains, but also about how one of the things that came up that my university attacked me on is the photo that's used in the cover of the book. And they said, how terrible it was. I was holding the skull with a smile on my face and, took a photo and said, this is actually not considered abnormal for the field. Those types of photos have been used for promotional purposes for a long time. Through his university, through places like the Smithsonian, even at my university before they got mad at me. And he was willing to write an affidavit about that and about also my level of expertise on handling remains and how that nothing I did was actually considered bad protocol. And I was very thankful to him, and I feel like the archaeological world is a poorer place since his passing. And even very recently, he was still publishing on research on artifacts of the Northeast Native American tribes and also on skeletal remains. So he was a really, a real archaeologist at heart, and just, loved the field in a way that many of us who are concerned about reburial do.
Right. And, it means so much to hear kind words and words of support from a well respected colleague like that, especially sometimes you don't know that they're paying attention to what's happening to you,
Right.
but they really are. And that means so much. And that's why sometimes we have podcast colleagues who are going through a hard time or facing a lot of criticism. And I try to reach out to some of them in private, right, and just give them words of support. And it really seems to go a long way and carry a lot of meaning for people when you do that. But I wanted to bring up some breaking news real quick that it was happening today. And it brought to mind some of the things we were talking about and the importance of anthropology and its broader implications. So there were a lot of earthquakes in California today. And
Right.
I don't have the latest update. You may have seen this, Elizabeth. A 7.3 is the last I saw offshore, but a lot more inland as well. And there was a tsunami warning. And hopefully everything is okay. I haven't got an update on that. But, I feel like anthropology can tell us some things about natural disasters. If we don't have a chance to study some of these things, how do we ever know about, critical events like this or have the chance to learn about them? So, uh, do you ever see that in anthropology where with links to societal things like this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have it in some of the earliest sites, like the Turkish site that has been rebuilt multiple times, likely because of earthquakes starting at 10,000 years ago, and basically showing that people don't always abandon the land just because there has been disasters. Recently, we also have seen evidence of that the Pompeii victims weren't always, they weren't exactly what we thought they might be representing, but also that there were probably a lot more survivors than we had think. And just like the resilience of different people who you might think, well, why don't people just leave disaster zones? But anthropologists have shown that people will stick to their region. They will leave. They will come back. Other people come in, and so oftentimes, even though there are these kinds of disasters, those are also places of high resources, California being one of those. So you had, California being full of tribes, for prehistoric tribes, because of the high levels of resources. So even if something would happen to them that would scare them, it basically also is a rich enough place that it would tempt them back. So I think that's one of the things that anthropology has shown. I also, if you look at things like extinctions, some extinctions have been led by or have been caused by earthquakes or plate tectonic movement. So sometimes these have huge effects. But I think that in the end, what we find with anthropology, regardless of what population we're looking at, is human resilience. Resilience from droughts, resilience from the terrible cold climates that we see in the Alaskan Inuit mummies, and also resilience from earthquakes. And that in all of these places, even though some people may not have survived, they basically don't completely abandon the area. Sometimes there's a gap where people have said, there's no water, let's get out of here. But people come back. And I think that this speaks to human resilience. And when they come back, when new people come, they come back with better homes and more resources, because humans, that's human progress. So we learn from each other as well. So I do think that this shows, this is another example of that.
That's a great point. I also think it points to something in human nature too. I feel like it's some innate thing in us that says, you know what, we're going to stick it out. We've survived this, and we're going to be stronger, and we're going to be steadfast in our resolve here and stick it out. That seems to be a very human thing to me, because I think that if something like this were to happen to animals might just instinctively move on to somewhere else. But I think you brought up some great points, and we may circle back to this notion of resiliency, right? But one thing you brought up there that I think is really important that I wanted to ask you about is this, how interdisciplinary anthropology can be. So when you are looking at these natural disasters, I feel like you bring in all sorts of other fields into this. Elizabeth, do you think that this interdisciplinary approach, bringing in fields like history, genetics, other things, can that help, maybe get around some of these laws that you're dealing with, do you think?
It's kind of interesting, because anthropology, I think, has always been very interdisciplinary, and needs to be continue to be more so, because some of the fields that, like, if you look at reconstructing diet, you're looking at isotopic analyses of teeth to reconstruct what people ate in the past. You're going to be interdisciplinary with chemists. If you're looking at genetics, you're going to be interdisciplinary with geneticists. It's a little difficult to say. And my own experience, like when I did my PhD, I got a bachelor's in anthropology. I got a master's in anthropology. And then when I did my PhD, I did it in an interdisciplinary PhD of environmental dynamics, which was geology, geography, and anthropology. And so I think that this is a key point of anthropology and archaeology, is to be interdisciplinary. It's the only way we can truly understand humans and other animals too. I mean, we don't live outside of our habitat, right? And unfortunately, one of the things we're seeing now is that the laws that have entangled anthropology are expanding beyond anthropology and entering into these disciplines that we've been collaborating with. For example, some of the new changes in both the federal law and the California law requiring geologists to consider whether the soil that they're looking at actually held any human remains in the past, whether there's human remains there or not. So this entangles them in a way that they hadn't been entangled. And just maybe 2 weeks ago, I went to a National Science Foundation and NAGPRA event on Zoom that talked about how NAGPRA should be used on other collections, such as natural history collections. And they were talking about the repatriation of not only human remains and artifacts that might have slipped into a natural history collection, but seeds, botanicals that might be considered sacred to tribes. So it would seem that being interdisciplinary should have been kind of a way to rescue anthropology, but instead anthropology has contaminated the other fields.
Oh no.
So it's a very, very tricky situation, and I hope that the natural scientists, the biologists, and the environmental scientists fight back against this overreach and do not cave in.
Well, it certainly seems to be something that's being met with controversy and resistance. And CJ was going to ask you a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm really curious. You have definitely experienced some cancel culture. You mentioned it earlier. You got canceled by everybody, by your school. You had to fight back. And is there a chance that you've been blacklisted at some of these other schools, that when you reached out to find out about what could be studied of their remains, that they simply gave you a blanket answer because of who you are?
That is a possibility, and actually, many people just didn't respond to me. Quite honestly, many people just were like, "Yeah, it's their job to respond to me. If you are a NAGPRA coordinator or a CalNAGPRA coordinator, it is your job to answer these questions."
Yeah.
But I try to get away from that issue of, are they just not responding to me because of who I am, by clearly stating in my email that I'm not reaching out to look for a collection, that I have actually been given a grant to find the answer, regardless of what answer it is. And so I had hoped that that would alleviate their concerns that I would be knocking on their door. But nevertheless, it could be one of the reasons why I didn't get as many responses as I had hoped. I think I have been blacklisted from some of the anthropology associations. I don't think I would be able to present a talk at the American Anthropological Association, for example, or the Society for American Archaeology, or the California Society for Archaeology. The last time I've tried to submit something for their conferences, they were either rejected on baseless grounds or accepted and then withdrawn, like in the American Anthropological Association. So I'm not sure that I will be welcome at any of those. And I have yet to try to publish in one of their journals, but we will see.
Who knew you could make such waves in anthropology? Oh, well, I'm glad that you still have some mediums to get your information out. And it seems like through books and articles, you are being heard and your argument is being heard, because while, we all have the ability to disagree, we should also have the ability to speak our minds and give our point of view. So we are grateful that you have come on here to share your thoughts. And I know we've got some listener questions, but before we do that, let's dive into some hot takes, Tim.
Okay.
All right, let's get on it. And, I think that, let me pull this up. I kind of made a slideshow for the hot takes. This is All Things Unexplained first, a slideshow hot takes here. But let me add this to the stage. Maybe I can get it shrunk down a little. That's not quite what I'm looking for. CJ, I love the reaction. I don't think that's it. Back to CJ.
Oh, you're doing it again.
And nope. Nope. And hey, there we go. So Neanderthals and human ancestors, Elizabeth, one thing that worries me, this is such a fascinating connection to us and where we came from. And it seems like it worries me that these things that are going on could deny us the knowledge that so many of us seek, who we are, where we came from. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. When will the cancellation of research hit early human remains, such as Neanderthals? I would never say never. One of the things that is protecting the Neanderthals from now, at least, is that they're not in the Americas, they're not in Australia, and they're not in Canada. All three places that have taken kind of a very active role in reburying and skeletal remains. But like I said, it's a tricky question. It's interesting that when I was arguing with my colleagues about skeletal remains and photographs, and I had made the point of what's the difference between having a photograph of a non-human animal and what's versus a human, and like in an article or in publicity, and they were like, oh, it's a world of, some of them were like, oh, it's very different because a non-human animal is not human and so forth. And one of my colleagues, he quipped, well, what about Neanderthals? And that's very interesting, you know, like, where do we draw the line? You know, Neanderthal, we don't even know for 100% sure whether Neanderthals are the same species as us or not. They might be a cousin. Humans do have some Neanderthal DNA, but that could be related to the last common ancestor, Homo heidelbergensis. And so we do not have the DNA tests yet on Homo heidelbergensis, but some groups definitely have more Neanderthal DNA than others. And so that's an interesting aspect. And, you know, before we get, you know, to like, oh, well, you know, if you're looking at humans versus non-humans, you know, there's a distinction. You know, Neanderthals had larger brains than us. They had complex, you know, sites. They created various artifacts that are extremely interesting. They took care of their sick. I mean, there's not a single line that says this is like us and this is not. It's more of a gray area that's gradient, and drawing a line of what we're willing to show and what we're willing to research basically is a tricky thing. And therefore, my suggestion is keep those Neanderthal bones in museums, keep researching them, and let's keep an open mind in case you know, we learn something new.
Oh, totally. And, you know, that's one thing we were talking about resiliency, and we don't really know. Well, because on the face of it, on paper, you would say, wow, Neanderthal is crazy resilient, if not more resilient to things like natural disasters and such as us. But yet here we are, and Neanderthal is gone. So that brings up, you know, I said we'd circle back on this notion of resiliency and apocalyptic events. So this is less natural disaster and more extinction level events, Elizabeth. And, you know, one thing, there's so many mysteries here. Like, you know, we see a woolly mammoth and all these megafauna, the giant sloths, the saber-toothed tigers, etc. They all disappeared. But yet again, here we are. And what can anthropology tell us about things like this?
Well, I think that if you look at extinctions, you can look at them in two main ways. One is that there were about 5 mass extinctions. And the mass extinction is like when 75+% of the species just gets wiped out. Think of like the dinosaurs at 65 million years ago with the asteroid. But and there were earlier extinctions that were even more dramatic. But what we find is throughout time, there are extinctions occurring all the time. And some of these extinctions it's because the animals that go extinct could not survive the change in environment. Others is that they were hunted out. I mean, even the megafauna of the Ice Age, we don't know whether they died out because of being overhunted or because of a change in climate or because of both. But what I think is different with humans is that we're really good at manipulating our environment and living in different environments. And this makes us less likely to go extinct. And I'll say that that's not to say that there aren't other animals that don't have similar resiliency, but not through changing their environment, just because they're such generalists that they do well in lots of different environments. If I'm not wrong, like the cockroach is like 300 million years old.
Yeah.
As a species.
And I was actually avoiding comparing humans to cockroaches, but it did occur to me. It really did occur to me.
So I do think that's an interesting aspect. But then if you look at the human evolutionary tree, we have things like robust Australopithecines that lived from like 2.5 to 6.5 million years ago, and then they go extinct. And they had about a brain size about twice as big as an ape, but like a quarter the size of ours. So bigger than the apes, but smaller than ours. And it looks like they did not they were able to outcompete with the new genus of Homo, coupled with a change in environment. But we shouldn't think of them as an evolutionary failure. They were around for over 1 million years, and we haven't even been around for 500,000 years. So we should think of ourselves as newcomers, and we should remember that other species, even the ones who are extinct, might have had a very long time on this earth before they went extinct.
No, that's right. And that's why we should pay our respects to cockroaches, crocodiles, and sharks. I mean,
yes,
seriously, they have seen a lot more than we have. So our next hot take, Elizabeth, it really goes into how anthropology can apply to the cultural values and tell us about the beliefs and roles of things like religion in society. And I just wanted your hot take on religious artifacts, particularly these giant religious artifacts, the Holy Grail, Ark of the Covenant, Noah's Ark. I feel like anthropology plays a role here.
Yeah, I think biblical archaeology is quite an interesting field. I think it has really two types of archaeologists: those true believers and those who are just like, okay, I'm just interested in biblical archaeology, and we don't know where we don't know where these three artifacts are or whether they exist. The Ark, the Noah's Ark, or the Ark of the Covenant, or the Holy Grail. But what's interesting about like the Ark of the Covenant is, even though we don't know whether it exists or where, if it does, where it is, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has claimed that they have it, but they won't show it, and it won't be verified because of that. But what's interesting about it is that it actually looks similar to a lot of the ancient Egyptian storage units or casks that were used to store things. And so that so all the descriptions of them does sound like it would have been likely similar to something that had come from ancient Egypt. The other thing is, like with the Noah's Ark, although we don't have Noah's Ark, there's archaeologists who have documented multiple local floods that are mentioned in writings, in texts, and that are backed up by the Old Testament. And so you wonder whether a tale like Noah's Ark is based on this kind of experience that humans had with flooding, and they've created this greater myth about it. I believe that the New Testament has less archaeological links or facts to it that have been proven than the Old Testament. And this is likely more just because, like, the Hebrew Bible actually lists things like battles and sites, whereas the New Testament is more about ideas and language. But regardless of the validity of each one of these single ones, I think what's interesting is this kind of unification of humans all over the world have had the desire to find something sacred and special. And actually throughout the world, throughout history and prehistory and history, we see this progressing in a similar fashion of going from animistic polytheistic religions to then kind of like nature worship and the mountain worship and the Perus, to more monotheistic. So it shows kind of a progression through the ages, regardless of what culture you look at.
Right. And I just have to say, you know, is the Ark of the Covenant an example of alien technology? Ancient alien theorists would say yes. I
I
had to
don't think
say
so.
that. That's that's funny, right?
Interesting discussions in your home, I'm
I'm
sure.
not saying the Ark of the Covenant was aliens, but I've seen it on Ancient Aliens. And one last hot take for you, if you don't mind,
No.
Elizabeth. And we're so pleased to be joined by Dr. Elizabeth Weiss. I had to throw that in there. I'm sorry that I've got. Oh,
That
and
is perfectly fine.
I have to bring up, by the way, in case everybody doesn't know, if you turn to page 164 of Patricia
yeah.
Cornwell's new
Oh,
book,
I've got it. Do you have it with
Identity
you?
on it. Yeah, let's put it up
Oh.
here. Identity Unknown.
No, I have the actual book.
Do you know
Someone get
Patricia
it.
Cornwell, Elizabeth? So she has a
Yeah.
new book out, Identity Unknown. It has a very Avi Loeb-like character in it that is murdered and potentially by a UFO. There it is. And on page 164, two of the recurring characters in Patricia Cornwell's new book, Marino and who's the other one? Dorothy. They say that All Things Unexplained is their favorite podcast and Ancient Aliens is their favorite television show.
Oh, good. Very good.
That's on page 164. Everybody, check out Identity Unknown by Patricia Cornwell. But I just had to throw that out there. I couldn't. It just suddenly occurred to me, like, wow, this is a really interesting link between all of us. But my last hot take, Elizabeth, I can't help but think about this when we start talking about these bones and these laws, and I always wonder, man, about people 100, 500 years from now, and they're digging through bones, and I always think about this one individual, and his story just fascinates me. Joseph Merrick. He was also known as the Elephant Man, and he was horrifically disfigured. And you can see that's actually his skull there.
Right.
And tell us your thoughts, on situations like this and the need for anthropology.
Well, I think I've read quite a lot about his case. And what I think that anthropology does is it enables us to see the humanity once individuals are long gone. And so you might look at the skull and think, oh, that's a terrible thing. But when you know the backstory, you think, oh, well, actually, he was an incredibly interesting individual, and there were people who cared about him.
Yes.
And had he been living now, he would have had a different life. And, what would that life have been? And so one of my things that I've always been interested in is looking at unique individuals in skeletal collections, whether they're unique because of a disease or a pathology like Merrick, or whether they were unique for other reasons, injury, for example. And how did their society treat them? And one of the things you see is that although there's this kind of thought that, oh, well, we didn't become empathetic or caring until much later, is that this is not true. Even when you look at 2 million-year-old remains, you already see people who had horrific problems, horrific illnesses being cared for. And we can tell that by seeing whether somebody had, for example, an injury that would have made them unable to walk, but they were still being fed, they were still getting food, and they were still lived long enough for that injury to heal. And so I think that anthropology can provide us with answers of, that how people were cared of in the past, and that this is a unifying trait of our species, that we, and not only of our species, but of others, that we do care for those with ailments.
Yeah, and for people that don't know about Joseph Merrick, he was actually confined to basically a sideshow in a carnival type situation, and people didn't even know that he was very intelligent. He could read and he could write, and he taught himself how to read by reading the Bible. And he was actually quite intelligent. And of course, he had that famous line in the movie, I think, where he was being harassed by some people, and he finally just shouted out, "I am not an animal." And he was discovered by a doctor, I believe, in the sideshow, and who offered him a chance at a better life. He had to be a part of medical studies, kind of like we're talking about here, and
Yeah,
it gave him a chance at a better life.
and one of the interesting things, when I recently just came back from living in New York, I also went to Philadelphia to look, and I visited the Mutta Museum. And the Mutta Museum is a medical museum of mainly of disease or pathologies, many congenital pathologies, and two skeletons that were shown, that were on display, were actually of individuals who had donated their remains and had wanted their remains to be shown so that people can understand that, you can have these, in a sense, very striking pathologies, congenital diseases or pathologies that lead to deformations, malformations, and still be, intelligent, sympathetic, empathetic, and have a life. And so one of them, for example, is displayed with the female's favorite jewelry on the side, and her taught, a letter describing that, for example. So we've come a long way in understanding this. And I think that museums and universities need to continue to show people that that human variation, both normal variation and non-normal variation, does not need to be treated as taboo, but rather be treated as something that we can learn from.
Absolutely. There's lots to be learned. Lots. All right. We have a few listener questions for you. Thank you, Elizabeth, for answering those hot takes. And if you're just tuning in, this is All Things Unexplained. We are talking with Dr. Elizabeth Weiss. And now we're bringing in our listener questions. So if you haven't sent one yet and you have one, now is certainly the time, though we do have some from earlier that we will pull in. So this is from a unique person. And I'm not sure if this is meant as a dig or an actual question.
I think it's a misunderstanding.
Pun intended. Did the Native Americans consent to having their bodies donated to science is the question here. Maybe the better question is, these remains that are up for repatriation, where did they come from originally?
So it's a kind of interesting question. One of the things is that consent forms and consent is actually a modern aspect, and even regardless of whether it's Native American or non-Native American, consent is quite a modern concept. And so I would start by saying that regardless of whether individuals of any population, of any ethnic group consented in the past, we have no way of going back in time and asking, and therefore we should not assume that they would not have consented. And we should not put today's standards or morals on the past. And I think that that's part of it. But what's interesting is that in the early days of anthropology, many Native Americans actually worked side by side with anthropologists and archaeologists in excavating skeletal remains, because they saw that they had no problem with it from their perspective. So in a sense, where is consent there? And I would say, well, that is consent. But I think that is kind of a impossible question to answer. My thing is, let's say from now on, we should get consent. Absolutely. We know about consent now. There's so I think that we have to accept that there's changes. So if there are skeletal remains now to be accessed or donated, there should be consent. However, we should not ruin our ability to study the past because we think that they should have consented to a concept that was not even around. It's the same thing with photographs. Like, oh, well, did they allow their photos to be taken? They didn't even know that cameras would be invented. So it's kind of a straw man argument to say that all skeletal collections should be reburied unless consent was available.
Thank you. Okay, Charlie from NC. This feels like a Charlie that I know. What celebrity chef would you most like to make you dinner? It was a little off topic.
I know who I would vote for.
Gordon Ramsay.
Yes.
Same.
Gordon Ramsay. And I'd actually like Nick to start the dinner and then Gordon Ramsay to correct him.
I want to be there for that. I mean, I don't know how much
idea.
You could sell tickets to that, by the way.
Yeah, definitely. That would be amazing. All right. Do we have another one, Tim? Jay from Iowa, would you rather? What in the heck are these questions? Would you rather have unlimited sushi for life or unlimited tacos for life?
Tacos, no doubt about it. With Mexican beer. Mexican beer is better than sake to me, so definitely tacos.
There you go. We're really getting to know Elizabeth here with these questions. I like it. We're getting down to the brass tacks. Lisa from Sacramento, as an aspiring archaeologist, I'm curious, what advice do you have for students who want to pursue research in this field despite the challenges posed by new regulations?
Well, I would say I am absolutely not in favor of turning people off to archaeology or anthropology. I think that people should study it, even if it's going to be difficult. My suggestion is that if you can't gain access to collections here in the States, to try at other places like Europe. And hopefully things will change for the better eventually here in the States, and in Canada and Australia and New Zealand are also problematic. But my thing is that even if you're like, well, I'd like to do research on skeletal remains in the Americas, don't give up on it. Be vocal about your interest and be vocal about your concerns. But, anthropology and archaeology really needs to continue to thrive. And so I really hope that the next generation of people who are interested see what's going on and are aghast and want to turn it around, because that's the only way that we're going to save it.
Absolutely. And I think this will be our last question for the night. This is from Jennifer Holden, who just submitted a question. Thank you, Jennifer. As someone who has learned a lot from your work, who else would you recommend for my self-educational reading list?
Oh, well, okay. So I really love Doug Owsley's work, who's from Smithsonian. And there's a great book about him and about various cases called, I believe it's called No Bone Unturned by Jeff Benedict. Excellent book on anthropology and archaeology. I also, some of the other people who you might look into, one of the people who I've done a lot with is Glenn Custard, who's a linguist. He's done studies and given affidavits about the Paleo Indians. Jim Chatters, who was the first to investigate Kennewick Man, has continued to do research on Paleo Indians. And he publishes some interesting stuff as well. I love pop science books, so I think that there are some great ones out there, such as books, for example, there's the one I just mentioned by Jeff Benedict, but there's also a lot of books about Africa and human evolution. I've read Meave Leakey's book most recently, and it was excellent about the state of affairs in Africa. And paleoanthropology, so the study of fossil remains. Pat Shipman had a great book not too long ago on the domestication of dogs. So there's lots out there that's very interesting for anthropologists still.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. All right. Well, before we wrap up, Elizabeth, tell our listeners where they can find out more about you. Where can they pick up your book and read your article? And how can they follow along on your journey?
So my Twitter is Weiss Unburied. My new book, On the Warpath, My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors, is available on Amazon and pretty much every other venue you can think of. But, the other thing is I encourage you to, go to Google Scholar, and I have, a Google Scholar page. Just type in my name, and you can find the articles. Most of the articles I recently published also can be found in places like Minding the Campus and Quillette, so that are no paywall places. And finally, make sure that if you don't want to buy my book but you want to read it, make sure to ask your library to adopt that book.
Yeah, it's so fun. I just saw recently in our local library here an author who we had on not too long ago, who's out there trying to get his book out, and his book was in there. I thought that was cool, and it was featured too. It was featured as new nonfiction. Nice. Yeah, like that's exciting. I love when that happens. I love to read, and I love to promote authors, so it's wonderful to get your insight there. If you didn't hear earlier on the show, we've got a big Twitter thing going on at the moment. So hop over there after the show and chime in on that chat, everybody. We'd love to get your thoughts on what's going down in the UAP world today. And we thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining us. We hope that you will keep going and then keep coming back on this show to share all of your new work with us. And we hope that you can break down some of these barriers and keep researching so that we know more about ourselves, past, present, and future.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Tim, I'm going to send it to you for final thoughts.
Okay, my final thoughts. One, there's definitely something happening out there, folks. Times are getting strange. Something's going on at our military and nuclear facilities. Head over to our Twitter. We've got a lot going on about that tonight. I'm going to have a late night at AT Unexplained, ATU in Explain. Maybe I said that wrong. At AT Unexplained. I spelled it. It's on the screen. Check us out. You can head over to Twitter to check that out. We got a lot of things. I'll be on there probably a lot later tonight than I need to be. We really appreciate Dr. Elizabeth Weiss for joining us tonight. I think anthropology is such a noble scientific pursuit. For one thing, it gets you outdoors. It gets you off the screens, disconnected from the technology. And we have a lot of exciting things coming up for this show, CJ.
Oh, yes. I feel like you dropped a little Easter egg somewhere in this show tonight about a huge project that you've got coming up soon. And I'm not even sure that I'm allowed to say it. But something big is coming down the pipe in the next couple of weeks. Yes, something big. I can't exactly say what, but it's going to be on television. And I'm pretty stoked about it. We also have a book coming out soon. All Things Unexplained has a book coming out soon, and I can't wait for that to be out. As a matter of fact, somebody Elizabeth knows wrote the foreword. Nick Pope wrote the foreword for our book, and we really appreciate him doing that. And how did we write a whole book? We could barely spell AT Unexplained out loud.
We're visual learners, I suppose. So it's just fine. But anthropology, what a noble pursuit. Get off your screens, folks. Head out into the woods. Go look up at the sky. You may not find Bigfoot. You may not spot a UFO, but you might just find something even more important, and that is yourself. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you, CJ.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's wonderful.
Good night, everybody. I'm going to try to find the outro. There it is.
Okay.
All Things Unexplained.
What's your hot take on Travis Taylor?
I've got an exclusive for you guys if you want it about the Alaska.
We do.
Okay.
Dr. Taylor was revealed to be the chief scientist of the UAP task force with the Pentagon.
So some of that, I think, sir, we'll save for closed session.
All Things Unexplained is free to watch on YouTube and listen to wherever you get your podcasts. If you would like to support our show, you can visit our YouTube store. Additionally, you can find us on Venmo under All Things Unexplained. Be sure to check out our website, allthingsunexplained.com. All proceeds from the sales of Dr. Mounce's books on Amazon and Audible also go straight to our show.